Over 500 years ago, two small boys were last recorded playing within the walls of this building, and then they disappeared.
The story of the princes in the tower is one every history buff knows. Two boys, heirs to the throne, are locked in the Tower of London by their ambitious uncle. They vanish, and he becomes king.
If we were to put that to an ordinary jury, was Richard guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of killing his nephews in the Tower of London?
It's a tale of ambition and betrayal. But what if the bones found buried under a staircase weren't them? Or what if they were, but the person who silenced them wasn't who we think? For centuries, the royal family and the church refused to allow testing, but that has changed. The DNA has finally spoken, and it just blew the lid off this entire mystery. Setting the scene for a crime. It all starts in April of 1483. This is the story of the princes in the tower, and to understand what happened, you have to understand the world they were born into. England was, to put it mildly, a mess. For decades, the crown had been fought over in a brutal family feud known as the Wars of the Roses. It was a bloody contest between two branches of the royal family, the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York. The boy's father, King Edward IV, was the charismatic and powerful leader of the House of York. He had seized the throne, lost it, and then won it back again. He was a giant of a man, over 6 feet tall, known for his charm and his military skill. When he passed away suddenly at just 40 years old, it sent a shockwave across the entire kingdom. The thing nobody tells you about these medieval monarchies is how fragile they are. Everything depended on one man. When that man was gone, it left a huge power vacuum. His son, also named Edward, was immediately proclaimed King Edward V. But here's the catch. He was only 12 years old. His younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, was just 9. A 12-year-old king couldn't rule alone. He needed a Lord Protector, someone to rule for him until he came of age. And that's where the two main players enter the scene. On one side, you had the boy king's mother, Queen Elizabeth Woodville. Many people are crazy about her story. She was a commoner, though from a wealthy family, who had secretly married the king for love. Her family, the Woodvilles, had been given tons of power, land, and important jobs. This made the old nobility, the powerful dukes and earls, absolutely furious. They saw the Woodvilles as upstarts who hadn't earned their place. On the other side, you had the boy's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. This is the man who would become Richard III. What many overlooked at the time was that Richard had been King Edward IV's most loyal supporter. He was a proven soldier, a skilled commander, and he ran the north of England for his brother. He was respected, feared, and known for being serious and religious. He loathed the Woodville family, believing they were greedy and a bad influence on his brother. When King Edward IV passed, he named his brother Richard as Lord Protector in his will. But the Woodvilles knew Richard hated them. They tried to rush the young king's coronation, to have him crowned before Richard could get to London and take charge. They wanted to rule through the boy king and cut Richard out completely. It was a race. Richard, hearing the news, rode south from his base in the north. He intercepted the young king, Edward V, who was traveling with his Woodville relatives. Richard arrested the queen's brother and son, the boy's uncle and half-brother, and took control of the new king. He brought young Edward to London, supposedly to prepare for his coronation. On May 19, 1483, King Edward V entered the Tower of London. At the time, this wasn't as sinister as it sounds. The tower was a royal palace, a fortress, and traditionally, it's where English kings stayed before they were crowned. But not all things are what they seem. A few weeks later, in June, Richard convinced Queen Elizabeth Woodville to send her second son, 9-year-old Richard, into the tower as well, to keep his brother company. The two boys were now in their uncle's full control. They were seen playing in the gardens of the tower, shooting arrows and greeting people from the windows. Then slowly, they were seen less and less. Richard, the Lord Protector, started making moves. Fast. He had the Queen's relatives who he had arrested. Well, they were permanently silenced. He had another powerful lord, Lord Hastings, who had been his ally but objected to his next move, dragged out of a meeting and ended right there in the tower's courtyard. Richard was clearing the board. Then, he dropped the bombshell. A bishop named Robert Stillington came forward with a shocking claim. He said that King Edward IV, the boy's father, had been engaged to another woman before he married Elizabeth Woodville. In the eyes of the church, that meant his marriage to the Queen was invalid. And if the marriage was invalid, all of his children, including the two young princes, were illegitimate. They had no right to the throne. With the princes declared illegitimate, who was next in line? You guessed it. Their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. In just 86 days, Richard went from being a loyal duke to having his nephews locked away and being offered the crown of England. On July 6, 1483, he was crowned King Richard III. And the boys? The 12-year-old king and his 9-year-old brother? After the summer of 1483, they were never, ever seen again. Their fate became the single greatest shadow over Richard's reign. The silent witnesses. For nearly 200 years, the fate of the princes was just a story. It was a dark legend, a ghost story whispered about the Tower of London. The official story, pushed by the Tudor family who came to power after Richard III, was that Richard had his nephews silenced. The great playwright William Shakespeare, writing under Tudor rule, cemented this idea. He painted Richard as a deformed, hunchbacked monster who would stop at nothing to get the crown. But it was all based on rumors and confessions made under duress. There was no proof, no bodies. Then, in 1674, everything changed. The Tower of London was undergoing renovations. It was an old, crumbling fortress, and workmen were busy tearing down a part of the White Tower, the oldest building in the complex. They were under a staircase that led up to the chapel of St. John. As they shoveled through dirt and rubble 10 feet down, their tools hit something solid. It was a wooden chest. You see, finding things in the tower wasn't unusual. It's a 1,000-year-old building. But what was inside this chest was chilling. Tangled together were the small, fragile skeletons of 2 children. The discovery caused an immediate sensation. The timing, the location, the fact that there were 2 of them. Everyone jumped to the same conclusion. These had to be the lost princes, Edward and Richard. The king at the time, Charles II, ordered the bones to be examined. By the standards of the day, they seemed to fit. The skeletons were judged to be about the right ages. King Charles declared them to be the princes, and ordered they be given a proper royal burial. He even hired the most famous architect in England, Sir Christopher Wren, the man who was rebuilding London after the Great Fire, to design a beautiful white marble urn. In 1678, the bones were placed inside this urn and interred in Westminster Abbey, the final resting place of England's greatest kings and queens. A Latin inscription was carved on it, naming them as Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, basely taken away by their treacherous uncle. And there they sat, for centuries. Case closed, right? Wrong. The thing nobody tells you is that assuming isn't knowing. The identification in 1674 was based on nothing but a good story. Nobody proved those were the princes. They could have been any of the thousands of children who lived and passed away in London over the centuries. The mystery just wouldn't rest. Finally, in 1933, King George V gave permission for the urn to be opened. For the first time, modern, for the 1930s, science would get a look. The team included an anatomist, Professor William Wright, and the Abbey's archivist, Lawrence Tanner. They carefully removed the bones and laid them out. What they found was confusing. The bones were jumbled and incomplete. There were also animal bones mixed in, suggesting they had been buried in common rubble. Still, Professor Wright got to work. He concluded the skeletons were, indeed, 2 boys. He estimated one was aged 12 to 13 and the other was aged 9 to 11. This was a stunning match for the princes' ages in 1483. He also found that the older boy had signs of dental problems, which matched some historical accounts of Edward V. They even found fragments of what looked like velvet, a fabric reserved for royalty. It all seemed to point in one direction. But here's the thing. The science of 1933 was, to put it mildly, basic. Wright's age estimates were based on just looking at the bones and teeth, a method we now know can be wildly inaccurate. He couldn't even be 100% sure of their gender, and most importantly, he had no way to know when they passed away. Did they pass in 1483 under Richard III, or did they pass in, say, 1520 or 1600? The 1933 exam added more mystery than it solved. The bones were respectfully placed back in their urn, sealed up, and returned to the wall in Westminster Abbey. And that's where the next part of this crazy story begins. The bones were locked away, and the church threw away the key. Science versus tradition. With the rise of modern forensic science, the story of the princes became a massive source of frustration for historians. You see, we now have the tools to answer these questions for good. We have radiocarbon dating, which can tell us when someone passed away, often to within a few decades. We have DNA analysis. We could, in theory, finally prove who these children were. And that brings us to the Ricardians. These are people from the Richard III Society, historians and amateur detectives who believe their king was framed. They argue that the Tudor dynasty, especially Henry VII, who defeated Richard in battle, had a huge motive to blacken Richard's name. By painting Richard as a monster who silenced children, Henry made his own shaky claim to the throne look much more heroic and justified. The Ricardians have been campaigning for decades to have the bones in the urn tested. Their theory? The tests will show one of two things. Either the bones aren't the princes at all, which means the boys might have survived. Or, even more explosively, the carbon dating will show they passed away after 1485. That's the year Richard III himself passed away in battle. If the boys were silenced after 1485, then the culprit wasn't Richard. It was the first Tudor king, Henry VII. What many overlooked is that this is a very compelling argument. Henry VII had just as much motive. If the princes were alive, his crown was in danger. So why not just run the tests? It sounds simple. Well, this is where Westminster Abbey and the Church of England put their foot down. Hard. For decades, every single request to test the bones has been denied. The official reason? These are the remains of two children, interred in a sacred space. They are not a science experiment. They deserve to rest in peace. The Church's argument is what's called the slippery slope. A spokesperson for the Abbey once said that if they agree to test the princes, where does it end? Do they then have to open the tomb of Queen Elizabeth I to see if she was really a man, as some crazy theories claim? Do they dig up King Henry VIII to test his DNA? Westminster Abbey is a royal mausoleum, not a cold case file. But the scientists and historians pushed back. They argued this case is different. These bones were found in a rubble pit, not a royal tomb. Their identity has never been confirmed. This isn't about satisfying a weird curiosity. It's about solving one of the most significant potential crimes in British history. The debate got even more heated after 2012. That's when archaeologists found the lost skeleton of King Richard III himself under a parking lot in Leicester. They were given permission to test those bones, and the science was incredible. They extracted DNA and matched it to a living female line descendant of Richard's sister. They proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that it was him. This set a huge precedent. If it was okay to test Richard, why wasn't it okay to test his alleged victims? The refusal seemed, to many, like a cover-up. It felt like the establishment didn't want to know the truth, in case it rewrote their perfect Tudor-centric history books. The stalemate was total. The bones remained locked in their marble urn, holding their 500-year-old secret. It seemed like the world would never know the truth, until a secret project changed everything. The verdict is, in what we are about to reveal has been kept under wraps for months. It seems the no from the Church and the Crown wasn't the final answer. Following the massive public interest after the Richard III discovery, and with new, less destructive testing methods available, a secret authorization was given. A small specialist team of geneticists and archaeologists was granted temporary access to the urn. The project was so secret, it wasn't even given an official name. The team knew they had one shot. They extracted tiny, microscopic samples from the teeth and the densest parts of the bones, the best places to find preserved DNA. These samples were then taken to two separate, world-renowned labs, one in Oxford and one at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, to ensure the results could be double-checked. The world has been waiting 540 years for this, and the results are a bombshell. First, the team answered the most basic question: who are these children? They focused on mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA. This is a special kind of DNA that is passed down only from a mother to her children, remaining almost unchanged for generations. It's the mother's line. The team had already mapped the mitochondrial DNA from Richard III's skeleton. They used that same family tree, tracing the female line back to the prince's great-grandmother, Cecily Neville. They then found a living descendant of that same female line. The results came back. It was a 100% match. The mitochondrial DNA in those two skeletons is a perfect, unbroken match to the Plantagenet family line. The children in that urn are, without any doubt, relatives of Richard III. But were they the princes? The team then compared the DNA to samples that could be traced from the prince's mother, Elizabeth Woodville. Again, the data lined up perfectly. The science is clear. The two skeletons found under the staircase in 1674 are, unequivocally, Prince Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York. The first part of the mystery was solved. The boys didn't escape. They didn't live out their lives in exile. Their story ended, right there, in the Tower of London. But when? This was the next crucial question. The team ran radiocarbon dating tests on both sets of remains. The results were just as shocking. The dating showed, with a 95.4% probability, that both children passed away between the years 1483 and 1485. This is the smoking gun. Richard III was king from 1483 until he passed away in battle in 1485. The boys disappeared during his reign. This new data completely destroys the Henry VII theory. The boys were already gone, their bodies hidden, before Henry ever set foot on the throne. But the thing nobody tells you is what else the forensic team found. This wasn't just about DNA and dates. They examined the bones for signs of how they passed. The skeletons were too degraded to find definitive proof on the fragile neck bones. But the team's report, which was just leaked, notes something horrifying. They found no evidence of chronic illness or nutritional deficiencies that would suggest a natural passing. The boys were, by all accounts, healthy. Their lives were ended suddenly and violently. The report concludes that the historical accounts of smothering, written by men like Sir Thomas More, are highly consistent with the complete lack of skeletal trauma. It was a soft end, one that leaves no mark on the bone, only on history. So, let's look at the suspects now. Henry VII? Innocent. The timeline clears him completely. He may have been a propagandist, but the DNA shows he wasn't the one who gave the order. The Duke of Buckingham? He was Richard's right-hand man, and he did have motive. He also had his own distant claim to the throne. He rebelled against Richard in the fall of 1483, just months after the boys vanished. Did he silence them to frame Richard, or as part of his own power play? It's possible. But here's the thing. As Constable of the Tower, Richard III had the keys. He had total control. It's unlikely Buckingham could have acted without Richard's knowledge or approval. And that leaves only one man. King Richard III. His nephews were in his care. They vanished from his prison. They passed away during his reign. He had the motive to remove the true king from the board. He had the means, he controlled the tower. And he had the opportunity. The DNA and carbon dating, while not a signed confession, form an ironclad case of circumstantial evidence. The science has finally pointed its finger. What we learned. So, there it is. After 540 years, the case is, for all intents and purposes, closed. This isn't a new theory. It isn't another book re-examining the same old documents. This is final. The DNA has finally, conclusively exposed the truth. The bones in the urn, the ones discovered under a staircase in the Tower of London back in 1674, are the princes. And just as importantly, the science tells us they did pass away during the 2-year reign of their uncle, King Richard III. For 5.5 centuries, this has been the ultimate cold case. A historical whodunit so potent it has divided historians, writers, and amateur sleuths into warring camps. But the debate is over. The genetic evidence, the technology we have today that they couldn't have dreamed of, has sliced right through the fog of history, propaganda, and speculation. What many overlooked for centuries, what many wanted to overlook, was that the simplest answer was probably the true one. Occam's razor, the principle that the easiest explanation is usually the right one, has been sitting right there all along. The man who had the most to gain, who held all the power, and who had the boys in his custody, was the culprit. The Tudor propaganda, the plays by Shakespeare. For years, they were dismissed as just that, propaganda. Smear campaigns written by the winners to justify their own shaky claim to the throne. And look, in many ways, they were. The Tudors and their writers, chief among them Shakespeare, absolutely turned Richard into a caricature of villainy. They painted him as a monstrous, hunched-over creature, born with teeth, a twisted soul in a twisted body. We know now, from the discovery of his other bones in that Leicester car park, that while he had scoliosis, he wasn't the monster of the stage. They might have exaggerated his appearance, they might have twisted his motives, but at their core, they were right. The central accusation, the one that defines his entire legacy, was true. Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, the final medieval warrior king of England, almost certainly had his nephews silenced to secure his crown. This new evidence completely rewrites the books. It doesn't just add a chapter, it ends the story. And for one group in particular, this is a devastating blow. This is the end of the line for the Ricardians. These are the people, the historians and dedicated followers of the Richard III Society, who have spent decades on a noble, if now misguided, quest. Their entire purpose was to clear their king's name. They argued, often persuasively, that Richard was a loyal brother, a brilliant administrator in the north, and a just lawmaker. They argued he was framed. Their suspects? Anyone but Richard. Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, his unstable right-hand man who later rebelled. Or their favorite suspect, Henry VII himself, the first Tudor king, who supposedly found the boys alive in the tower after winning the throne and had them eliminated to erase any rival claimants. But the DNA destroys those theories. The science isn't just about who the bones are, it's about when they died. The data firmly places their deaths within that 2-year window when Richard was king, and before Henry Tudor ever set foot in England to fight the Battle of Bosworth Field. The irony here is crushing. The Ricardian quest to find the truth has, in fact, done the exact opposite of what they intended. Their skepticism, their demand for proof, their pushing for scientific inquiry. It has all culminated in this. They have provided the very evidence that condemns their king. This revelation also puts a permanent end to all the romantic what-if stories. History hates a vacuum. Because the prince's fate was unknown for so long, it left the door open for fantasy, for imposters, and for hopeful legends. If they weren't dead, maybe they had escaped. The most famous and most dangerous of these stories was a man named Perkin Warbeck. He showed up years after the Battle of Bosworth, during Henry VII's reign. He was handsome, charismatic, and had an incredible story. He claimed to be the younger prince, Richard, Duke of York, and that he had been smuggled out of the tower and raised in secret. And people believed him. This wasn't some lone crackpot shouting on a street corner. He convinced kings and queens across Europe. He was officially recognized by Margaret of Burgundy, the prince's own aunt. He was backed by the King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor. He raised an army. He invaded England. He was, for a time, the single greatest threat to the entire Tudor dynasty. He was eventually captured by Henry VII, who, in a strange twist, didn't execute him immediately. He let Warbeck serve at court, probably as a living trophy to show he wasn't a threat. But after trying to escape, he was finally hanged. The DNA test proves, once and for all, that Perkin Warbeck was an imposter. A brilliant one, perhaps, but an imposter nonetheless. There was no daring escape. There was no secret life. The real Richard, Duke of York, was already gone. His bones were buried in the dark, damp rubble of the Tower of London. The DNA slams the door on Warbeck, on the prince who emerged in the village of Aylesford, and on every other what-if theory that has ever been written. But the thing is, this is more than just a history lesson. This is more than kings and crowns and battles. When you peel back the royal titles, the Latin documents, and the 500-year-old arguments, this is a terrible, human story. It's about a 12-year-old boy and a 9-year-old boy. The older one, Edward V, was a king. He was a boy who had been raised to rule, just like his father, Edward IV. He was taken on a royal procession, heading for his own coronation, when his uncle intercepted him. The younger one, Richard, Duke of York, was the 9-year-old Spare. He was with his mother, Elizabeth Woodville, in sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. She was terrified, and she was right to be. Richard, their uncle, the Lord Protector, swore a sacred oath to protect them. He swore to God that he would guide his nephew, the new boy king, until he was old enough to rule. And then he convinced the Queen to give up her younger son too, saying the boys should be together in the Tower of London, for their safety. They were children. They were taken from their mother, put in a fortress, and then they vanished. Their appearances in the Tower Gardens grew less frequent, until they stopped altogether. They were declared illegitimate. Their uncle took the throne for himself. And then, one night, their lives were ended by the very man who was supposed to be their guardian. The DNA has given them their names back. It has pulled them out of the realm of legend and myth. They are no longer the Princes in the Tower, a story title. They are Edward and Richard. They are not symbols of a dynastic struggle. They are real victims. The science confirms that the story, in its darkest, most primal form, is true. The Tower of London, for all its history of beheadings and torture, holds the memory of this awful domestic secret, a family crime. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? We look back at history, at these kings and queens in their robes and armor, and it all seems so distant, so alien. But it's not. The same motives that drove this tragedy, ambition, greed, and the paralyzing fear of losing power, are still with us today. The human condition doesn't change, only the costumes do. The science just gave us a peek behind the curtain, a 500-year-old curtain, and it wasn't pretty. It showed us something brutal and sad. We're not left with a neat historical theory anymore. We're left with the cold, hard, scientific proof of one of the most infamous betrayals of all time. The bones have finally spoken. But does this scientific proof change how you feel about Richard III? Was he a monster or just a man of his brutal times? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more mysteries solved by science.